Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more amazing HFY stories. Hit the bell icon to get notified about our latest uploads. The days bled together in a haze of dim light and the constant hum of the marketplace. Serena, though bound by chains and an invisible weight heavier than the physical ones that clung to her wrists, remained calm. She had seen the worst of what the universe could offer: war, suffering, betrayal, and yet, here, in this hellish corner of the galaxy, she found herself surrounded by beings of every shape and color. Some were broken beyond recognition, their spirits crushed by the brutal system that held them captive. Others, like her, had not yet succumbed to despair. Serena's life had once been one of luxury and power. The Zither people were ancient, proud, and revered for their beauty and intellect. They had long ago mastered the arts of diplomacy, wielding their charm and charisma as deftly as their sharpest blades. Serena had been raised to become the perfect symbol of Zither's grace, taught to speak with the perfect cadence, to move with fluid elegance, and to always keep her emotions in check. It had been her mother's dream to see her married to one of the galaxy's most influential rulers, ensuring the Zither's legacy lived on. But that dream had died the moment Serena made her own decision. She had always felt a pull within herself, a yearning to break free from the chains of tradition and expectation. Her mind was sharp, her ideas revolutionary, and her spirit unbroken. As a child, she had longed to leave the gilded cage of her family's palace and explore the vastness of the stars. She had never understood the pomp and circumstance that defined her people's hierarchy, nor the endless political games played by her parents. They had seen her beauty as nothing more than an asset, one to be used to further their influence in a galaxy full of power-hungry factions. But she would not be a pawn. When Serena refused to be married off as part of a political alliance, her parents turned on her. Her mother, once her closest confidant, had labeled her rebellious, defiant, and ungrateful. Her father had ordered her to be kept under strict guard, her movements monitored, and her choices stripped away. The first time she tried to run, she was caught within hours. But she had learned from the experience. She had waited, observed, and plotted, her desire for freedom burning ever brighter. But even the most carefully laid plans could be undone in the blink of an eye. In an act of betrayal too cold for words, her parents had orchestrated her fall into the hands of the slavers. Serena had been sold as a trophy, her beauty and royal bloodline her only value in the eyes of her new masters. The slavers knew nothing of her people, nor did they care. They had only heard whispers of the Zither's reputation and had decided to profit from it. To them, she was just another commodity to be traded. At first, Serena had fought. She had resisted with every ounce of strength in her, using her intelligence and the training she had received as a noblewoman. But the brutal realities of life in the slave market had quickly shattered any illusions of escape. There were no allies here, no friends to turn to. Every prisoner was a potential threat, a competitor for scraps of food, water, and even moments of peace. The slavers were merciless, exploiting their captives to the fullest extent. It wasn't long before Serena understood the cruel irony of her situation. She had come from a world where her beauty and grace had made her a symbol of power, only to find herself in a place where those very traits were nothing more than a means to an end. Her mind, her strength, her independence, they were irrelevant to those who held her in chains. They saw only a beautiful object, a thing to be sold, used, and discarded. Yet, in the quiet moments between the chaos, Serena allowed herself to dream. She dreamt of a world where her life wasn't dictated by the whims of others, where she could choose her fate. She dreamt of a time when she would stand tall again, not as the daughter of a powerful family, but as a person in her own right. Her heart longed for the unknown, for the stars that had once called to her. Somewhere out there had to be a place where she could be free. But freedom was a distant hope, one that seemed impossible amidst the cruelty of the slavers. Still, Serena refused to let herself become like the others. She watched, waited, and learned. The slavers weren't invincible, after all. There were cracks in their system, moments of vulnerability that she could exploit. She had been trained in the arts of strategy, after all, even if her parents had only ever used it for diplomacy. Serena's mind was sharp, and she honed her skills in secret, using her position to gather information. She knew the layout of the market, the routines of the guards, and the weaknesses in their operations. Every night, when the others slept in their miserable cells, she sat alone, planning. She studied the guards' movements, noted the times when the market was most chaotic, and began to gather resources. Her resolve grew stronger with each passing day. She would not die here. She would not let her life be reduced to a mere footnote in the history of her people. She had a destiny, one that no one could take from her. But even with all her plans, Serena knew she would need something, someone, that could help her escape. A key, a weapon, a distraction. She couldn't do this alone. The thought of trusting another soul was terrifying, but she realized she had no choice. She needed an ally. It was then, as if the universe itself had been listening to her silent plea, that a figure appeared, a human warrior. Cade Denar, a man whose presence was as fierce as it was calming, like the calm before a storm. The first time Serena saw him, she was standing in the shadows, eyes narrowed as she studied the new arrivals to the market. His eyes met hers for just a moment, and in that instant, something inside her shifted. She didn't know if he was a mercenary, a bounty hunter, or something else entirely. But she knew one thing, he was different. There was something in his gaze, a raw intensity, a strength that spoke of a life lived in the trenches of war, that made her pulse quicken. Serena didn't trust easily, but in this world of constant betrayal and pain, Cade might just be the key to her freedom. Cade Denar had lived a life drenched in blood. Born on a shattered earth, raised among the scars of endless wars, he had learned to survive not by kindness or diplomacy, but by the hard truths of the battlefield. He was no stranger to loss, to pain, or to the darkness that often consumed men who were too long in the service of others. A former soldier of the Terran Empire, Cade had earned a reputation as a warrior without equality. He was a man who had killed, who had survived against overwhelming odds, and who, more than anything, had long since abandoned any hope for redemption. But that was before he heard of the Zether Princess. When the job first came across his desk, it had been nothing more than another contract, a nameless mission with little more than credits to be earned at the end of it. A high-profile rogue faction had been sabotaging trade routes, and Cade had been hired to track them down, neutralize the threat, and collect a hefty sum in return. He had seen similar jobs countless times before, and at first, he had been indifferent. It was just another assignment in a long line of many. Then he'd heard the rumors, whispers in the darker corners of the galaxy, where information moved faster than light, and secrets were as valuable as currency. There was a woman, they said. A beautiful alien woman, of royal blood, stolen from her people and sold into slavery. A Zether. Her name was Serena, and she had been abandoned by her family, left to rot in the hands of merciless slavers who would sell her to the highest bidder. At first, Cade had dismissed the story as just another tale spun by dreamers and schemers. But there was something about the way the name, Serena, rolled off the lips of those who spoke it. Something about the way the details didn't add up, as if this wasn't just another run-of-the-mill slave trade, but something far more significant. Perhaps it was his own experience with loss, with betrayal, that made the story hit harder. Or maybe it was just the idea of a woman with a destiny far beyond the simple exploitation of her beauty that made Cade take notice. The truth was, Cade wasn't the kind of man who normally cared about the plight of others. He had long ago abandoned the idea of being a hero. He was a weapon, plain and simple, and his job was to destroy. But there was something in those stories that stirred something inside him, a sense of justice long forgotten, a sliver of hope that there could be something worth fighting for beyond credits and survival. So, he followed the trail. Cade's journey took him to the outer reaches of the galaxy, to a place where even the brightest stars seemed to have given up on shining. The slaver market where Serena was held was a sprawling complex of rusted ships and decrepit buildings, hidden away on a planet that seemed to have no name, just a collection of broken dreams and discarded souls. He knew that getting in and out would be a challenge, especially with the mercenaries guarding the place, but Cade had always excelled at turning the odds in his favor. He arrived under the cover of night, his ship landing in the shadows of a crumbling warehouse on the edge of the market. The air was thick with the stench of sweat and desperation, the cries of the enslaved echoing from the distant cages. It was a place where hope came to die, where prisoners were traded like livestock, and where the weak were crushed beneath the weight of power and profit. Cade's first instinct was to blend in, to disappear into the crowd of traders and buyers who populated the market. He kept to the shadows, observing, waiting for the right moment. The last thing he needed was to attract attention before he had a plan in place. It didn't take long for him to find the one who had caught his attention, the woman at the center of all the rumors. Serena. She was a striking figure, even in the dim light of the market, though her beauty was not the first thing Cade noticed. No, it was the way she held herself, how her gaze cut through the haze of despair and looked straight ahead, her posture regal despite the chains that bound her. Her eyes, deep and unreadable, told stories of sorrow and strength, of a spirit that refused to break. She stood apart from the other slaves, not because she was more beautiful, but because there was a fire in her that set her apart from everyone else. Cade found a secluded spot from which to observe her, noting how she was treated by the slavers. They mocked her, taunted her, as though her beauty was her only worth. But she never flinched. Never showed fear. That was the first time Cade realized she wasn't like the others. She was different. His mind worked quickly, assessing the situation. He knew it wouldn't be easy. There would be guards, mercenaries, and other obstacles between him and Serena's freedom. But he had a plan, one that relied on speed, precision, and above all, surprise. He would need to act fast. The slavers were busy haggling over the price of a group of captured traders when Cade made his move. Quiet as a shadow, he slipped into the narrow alleyways between the market stalls, weaving his way toward Serena's cell. His hands were steady, his heart pounding only slightly faster than usual. He'd done this kind of thing 100 times before, sneaking in, taking out a guard or two, and slipping away unnoticed. He reached Serena's cell in minutes, his pulse now matching the rhythm of his breathing. She was alone, standing near the back of the enclosure, her eyes locked onto the entrance, waiting. It was as if she had known he was coming. Or perhaps she was just waiting for any chance at freedom. Cade didn't speak. He simply reached through the bars, unlocking the door with swift precision. Serena didn't flinch, didn't even hesitate. She stepped forward, her eyes meeting his for the briefest moment, and in that instant, Cade saw something unexpected: trust. It was fleeting, almost imperceptible, but it was there. He motioned for her to follow, and without a word, Serena slipped from the cell. She was graceful in her movements, but there was no mistaking the strength in her. She wasn't just a helpless prisoner, she was a woman with purpose. Together, they disappeared into the shadows, the first step of an uncertain journey toward freedom. The air outside the slave market was thick with the stench of burning fuel and dust. The constant hum of machinery, the clanking of chains, and the cries of other slaves seemed to fade away as Cade and Serena moved through the shadows. He could hear his heartbeat pounding in his ears, his senses sharpened from years of training. But he remained focused, always watching, always listening. Serena was silent as they moved, but Cade could feel the weight of her presence beside him. It was as though her every step was deliberate, as though she, too, understood the danger of their situation. The market was a labyrinth of rusted structures and hidden alleyways, and though they were now beyond the walls of their immediate prison, their escape was far from guaranteed. Cade had been planning this moment for days, observing the movements of the guards, marking the patterns of the slavers. He had a route in mind, a series of passages that would lead them to the spaceport at the edge of the city. There, a ship had been waiting for them, a relic from his past. It was his only chance, and it was their only chance. As they neared a narrow street that led to the industrial sector, Cade motioned for Serena to stay low. He could hear voices approaching, two slavers, talking about their latest haul. They were too close for comfort. Cade quickly scanned their surroundings. He knew they couldn't afford to be seen. If they were caught now, their escape would be over before it had even truly begun. "Stay here," he whispered to Serena, his voice low but firm. Without waiting for a response, Cade slid into the shadows, pressing himself against a nearby wall. He could feel the heat radiating from the metal as the slavers passed by, unaware of the two fugitives just feet away. The seconds stretched into minutes, and Cade's breath came in slow, controlled exhales, the tension in his muscles building with each passing moment. When the voices finally faded, Cade exhaled in relief. He gestured to Serena, signaling for her to follow. They continued moving, taking the winding alleyways that Cade knew so well. As they rounded a corner, the distant hum of a vehicle caught his attention. A transport ship, moving toward the outskirts of the city. It wasn't their ship, but it was enough to remind him of the clock ticking down. "Stay close," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Serena nodded, her eyes scanning their surroundings, alert but composed. Cade couldn't help but notice how different she seemed from the frightened captive he had first encountered. There was a fire in her now, a resolve that mirrored his own. It was as if she had transformed from a prisoner into a partner in their escape, each step forward a symbol of her growing strength. They reached a dead-end alley, and Cade paused, his eyes narrowing. Just ahead, a small maintenance door led into the underbelly of the city. It wasn't much, just an unmarked, dirty passageway, but it would give them a way into the industrial sector without attracting attention. Cade approached the door carefully, checking the lock before pulling out a small tool from his pocket. His fingers moved with practiced ease, and within moments, the door clicked open. "After you," he said, stepping aside to let Serena enter first. She hesitated for a moment, glancing at him before stepping into the dimly lit corridor. Cade followed quickly, closing the door behind them with a soft click. The passageway was narrow and smelled of oil and old machinery. It was a far cry from the sleek, polished halls of the Zephyr Palace, but Serena seemed unfazed. She moved with purpose, her eyes fixed ahead. Cade was impressed. Despite everything she had been through, despite the life she had been forced into, Serena carried herself with an air of dignity that few could ever hope to maintain. They moved through the tunnels, Cade leading the way. The sounds of the city above them seemed distant, muffled by the walls of steel and concrete. The passage was long, and they didn't speak, both too focused on the task at hand. The silence between them was not uncomfortable, but filled with an unspoken understanding. They were both survivors, both shaped by their pasts, but both also determined to forge a new future. As they reached the far end of the tunnel, Cade peered out through a narrow crack in the door. Beyond it, he could see the industrial sector stretching out into the night, a sprawling complex of factories and warehouses. The shipyard was just beyond, but they would have to move quickly to avoid detection. "There," Cade pointed. "Our exit." He moved to push the door open, but the sound of footsteps from the other side made him freeze. His eyes flicked to Serena, who was already stepping back into the shadows, her face tense with anxiety. Cade held up a hand to signal her to stay quiet. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, two figures, walking in sync. He had no doubt they were slavers, possibly looking for him or Serena, or perhaps checking the area after their earlier escape. Either way, they couldn't afford to be caught now. Cade's hand went to his side, where his blaster rested in its holster. He could take them both out with a single shot. But that would cause too much noise, too much attention. They had to remain invisible. He waited, listening to the footsteps as they grew closer. His heart pounded in his chest, but his breath remained steady. He could hear their voices now, low murmurs that barely registered as they passed the door. "Don't know why the boss bothered with this sector. Nothing but junk around here," one of them said. I heard they were trying to sell off some of the Zether captives, the other replied, his voice laced with cynicism. Good money in that. Cade clenched his jaw, but he didn't move. He could feel Serena beside him, her body tense as if waiting for some signal. The slavers passed by, oblivious to the two fugitives hiding just a few feet away. Cade's muscles ached with the effort to remain still, but he didn't dare break their cover. Not yet. Once the footsteps faded into the distance, Cade motioned for Serena to follow. They pushed the door open just enough to slip through, and in moments, they were outside, breathing in the cooler air of the industrial sector. Ahead of them, a battered transport ship sat idle, its engines humming softly in the night. It was small, not much more than a cargo vessel, but it was enough for what they needed. Cade had prepared it in advance, making sure the ship was hidden and ready for takeoff. We're almost there, he whispered to Serena, who had stayed close behind him the entire time. As they approached the ship, Cade's mind raced. They had made it this far, but there was no guarantee they would make it off the planet without trouble. The slavers would be searching for them, and they had no idea what kind of forces they might be up against. But there was no turning back now. Get on board, Cade said, his voice firm. We're leaving. Serena nodded, her eyes focused ahead. The moment they stepped onto the ship, it would be their only chance to escape. As Cade followed her up the ramp, he felt a sense of exhilaration he hadn't experienced in years. They were free, at least for now. But there was still a long road ahead. The galaxy was vast, and Serena's enemies would be relentless. But as the ship's engines roared to life and they lifted off into the stars, Cade knew one thing: the journey had only just begun. The stars stretched out before them, endless points of light that twinkled like distant promises. Cade sat in the pilot's seat, his hands steady on the controls, his eyes scanning the vast expanse of space ahead. The ship hummed beneath him, a familiar sound that he had grown accustomed to over the years. It was a small transport vessel, unremarkable, but for the moment, it was all they had. Serena stood behind him, her posture still dignified despite the trials she had just endured. She didn't speak as they made their way away from the planet, but Cade could feel her presence. It was quiet, not uncomfortable, but pregnant with unspoken questions and emotions. He could see it in the way she watched the stars outside the viewport, her expression distant, her mind likely still grappling with the magnitude of what had just happened. The escape had been too easy, Cade thought. It felt like a dream, a moment of grace amid years of darkness. He had always known that the first step toward freedom was the hardest, but now that they were in the blackness of space, with the endless void stretching before them, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Where do we go now? Serena's voice broke the silence, low but steady. Cade glanced over his shoulder at her, his eyes narrowing slightly. The question wasn't just practical, it was personal. What was he to her now? A rescuer? A fellow fugitive? Or simply another man who had used her for his own purposes, like so many others before? I've got a place, Cade said, his voice firm. A safe house on the edge of Terran space. We'll lay low for a while, regroup, figure out what to do next. Serena nodded, but Cade could see the uncertainty in her eyes. She had been a prisoner, an object of desire and ownership, and now she was free, but for what? She was no longer just the Zether princess, she was a woman with a price on her head, a woman who had lost everything. The weight of that must have been crushing. But she didn't let it show. She had already come so far. She had endured so much. And yet, Cade could sense her conflict. She wasn't the kind of woman to be coddled, and though she might not say it, she was still trying to figure out what her place in this new world was. They traveled in silence for hours, the ship cutting through the black void at sublight speeds. Cade kept a wary eye on the radar. His fingers moving deftly across the controls. There was always the chance that the slavers, or worse, the Zether Empire, would come after them. He didn't doubt for a moment that they had made enemies in every corner of the galaxy. And the Terran Empire, despite his previous affiliation, wasn't a place Cade trusted either. But there was one thing Cade knew for certain. They couldn't outrun the past. They could only run forward, hoping that the future would offer a new beginning. Hours turned into days as they pushed deeper into space. Cade allowed himself a few moments of respite, but his mind was always on alert. He checked the ship's systems, recalibrating the navigation unit, adjusting fuel levels, and always making sure they were on the correct course. It wasn't that he didn't trust Serena. He didn't trust the galaxy. Not anymore. Serena had spent the time mostly in the rear compartments, taking care of herself and organizing her things. She didn't speak unless spoken to, and though Cade could sense her growing anxiety, she kept it well hidden. She had always been a creature of grace, and even now, she held herself with the same poise as when he had first seen her in the slave market. Cade didn't pry. He knew better than to force someone to talk about their past, especially someone like Serena. She had her own demons, her own struggles. And while he had his own, they were two separate worlds, each with their own baggage. It was on the fourth day, when they were nearing the fringes of Terran space, that things began to take a turn. Cade was standing in the cockpit, staring out at the void, when a sudden blip appeared on the radar. His hand immediately went to the controls, eyes narrowing as he studied the signal. It wasn't a random fluctuation, it was a ship. A large one. "I don't like this," Cade muttered to himself, fingers tapping on the console. It was too far out in the void to be anything ordinary. Whoever it was, they were tailing them. The ship was coming in fast, moving in a way that suggested they were being tracked. "What is it?" Serena's voice came from the doorway, calm but alert. "It's a ship," Cade replied, his voice taut with tension. "And it's following us." He adjusted the controls, trying to get a better reading on their trajectory. The ship was closing in quickly. Whoever it was had to be good, skilled even. There was no other explanation for how they had managed to follow them so effortlessly. "Do you think it's the slavers?" Serena asked, her face pale but composed. Cade didn't answer right away. It could be the slavers, though he had hoped he'd lost them for good. But there was also a chance it was someone else, a bounty hunter, a mercenary, or even someone with a vendetta against him. It wouldn't be the first time someone had come after Cade for personal reasons. "Could be," Cade said, his voice low and serious. "But whoever it is, they're not just looking for trouble. They're hunting us." Serena didn't flinch at his words. She had already learned how to survive, how to fight back when it mattered. But there was no denying the gravity of the situation. They were out in the cold vastness of space, far from any kind of help. Cade had always prided himself on being able to think his way out of any problem, but the feeling in the pit of his stomach told him that this time, they might not be able to escape unscathed. As the ship drew nearer, Cade's eyes flicked to Serena. She was standing quietly by the doorway, her posture tense, but there was something else in her eyes now, something sharp and calculating. She was no longer just the helpless princess. She was a woman of action. Cade nodded to himself. There was no time for hesitation. "Get to the back," he said, his voice firm. "I'll need you to help me get us out of this. We don't have time to be careful anymore." Serena's gaze didn't falter. She gave him a single nod, turned, and disappeared into the lower compartments of the ship. Cade didn't wait. He pulled up the weapon systems and began preparing for what was to come. Whoever was out there, whoever had followed them, was about to learn the price of making the mistake of underestimating a Terran warrior. And a Zethar princess. The tension in the ship was palpable as Cade adjusted the course to avoid any direct confrontation with the unknown vessel. His mind raced as he assessed their options. The ship following them was now less than half a click away, closing fast, and Cade knew that if they didn't act quickly, they would be trapped. His fingers flew over the controls, activating the defensive systems and preparing the ship for combat. A light blinked on the console, confirming that the weapons were fully operational. He had been a soldier long enough to know how to use every inch of his ship to its fullest potential, but he hoped it wouldn't come to that. If the ship trailing them was hostile, there would be no easy way out of this. The ship's engines hummed beneath him, thrusters firing to adjust their course. He wasn't in the best position to evade them, not with the limited speed of his transport vessel. They were too close. Cade cursed under his breath. They had to do something fast. In the back of the ship, Serena was preparing herself. Cade had given her a quick rundown of the ship's systems, making sure she knew how to assist if things went south. She wasn't a soldier like him, but she wasn't helpless either. She had the training of her people, of royal blood, but beyond that, Cade had seen her fight for her survival in ways that most would never understand. She was a survivor, just like him. He could hear her moving in the back, securing herself and the emergency equipment in case they had to abandon ship. The subtle sound of her boots against the metal floor was the only noise in the otherwise silent craft. Cade's hand hovered over the weapons console as he prepared to engage the unknown ship. He had to be careful, he couldn't afford to miss. His eyes flicked to the radar. The enemy ship was now closing in fast, its silhouette a dark shape against the infinite stars. It was a sleek craft, built for speed and maneuverability, something clearly designed for pursuit. Whoever it was, they had resources. "Serena, hold tight," Cade called over the comms. His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it. "I'm about to take evasive maneuvers. If it gets too hot, I need you to handle the secondary weapons." There was a moment of silence before Serena's voice came back through, calm as always. "Understood. I'm ready." Cade's grip tightened around the controls as he executed a sharp turn, sending the ship veering into a high-velocity roll to avoid a direct hit. The enemy ship's blasters fired, but Cade's maneuver had taken them off course. Still, the warning lights flashed, indicating a near miss. The tension in the air grew heavier. Cade's heart was hammering in his chest, adrenaline coursing through him, but he kept his focus sharp. He couldn't afford to panic, not with Serena's life on the line. His comms buzzed with a sudden transmission, and Cade's eyes narrowed in suspicion. The voice was harsh, clipped, and with an unmistakable tone of authority. "Unidentified ship, this is Captain Vrax of the Hegemon. Surrender your vessel immediately. You are in violation of intergalactic law and harboring fugitive slaves." Cade froze for a moment, trying to make sense of the message. "The Hegemon," he muttered to himself. He recognized the name. The Hegemon was one of the most feared mercenary factions in the galaxy, a brutal and efficient group known for enforcing the interests of the highest bidder. The fact that they were involved in this made the situation 10 times worse. They weren't just any bounty hunters, they were mercenaries with a reputation for exterminating anything in their path. Cade's hand went to the comms, voice low but laced with defiance. "I'm not surrendering to anyone, especially not a bunch of mercenaries." The silence that followed was heavy. It felt as though the entire galaxy held its breath. Then came the cold, calculating reply. "You will regret this decision. Your ship is outmatched. You have no choice but to comply." With those words, the enemy ship opened fire again, this time landing a direct hit on the starboard engine. The ship rocked violently, throwing Cade against the controls. His knuckles whitened around the console as he fought to regain control, the rattling of the ship's hull warning him of the damage. Sparks flew from the control panel, and the lights flickered. "We're taking damage." Serena's voice echoed from the back of the ship. "I can't get a lock on their weapons yet. I need more time." Cade's mind raced. They couldn't keep evading for much longer. If they didn't act soon, the Hegemon would destroy them. "Give me a shot," he said, teeth gritted. "Make it count." He pushed the throttle forward, giving their ship a burst of speed as he aligned their course with the hegemon vessel. Cade's hand moved to the weapons panel, and with a sharp press of a button, he fired a round of concentrated plasma at the approaching mercenary ship. The shot missed. Cade cursed. His hands moved quickly to make another adjustment, but there was no time. The enemy ship was closing in, its weapons primed for another blast. Damn it, Cade. We need more power to the shields. Serena's voice crackled through the comms. They're about to hit us again. Do what you can. Cade snapped, his voice rising in frustration. The next few seconds were a blur of fire and noise. The enemy ship's weapons fired again, and this time, the blast hit squarely against the hull. Cade gritted his teeth as the entire ship shuddered from the impact. Warning lights flashed across the dashboard, signaling critical damage. Cade barely held onto the controls as his ship's systems began to flicker, and the world outside the viewport seemed to explode with colors and lights from the barrage of fire. He wasn't sure how much longer they could survive under this kind of assault. They had been caught in a fight they had no business winning. Then, a voice from behind him, a sharp tone cutting through the chaos. Hold on. Before Cade could react, he heard the unmistakable hum of the secondary weapon systems powering up. Serena had taken matters into her own hands. Cade didn't have time to stop her, but something in his gut told him that this wasn't just a desperate attempt, it was a calculated move. Serena's voice came through the comms again. Targeting their weapons. The energy pulse from the secondary systems flared to life, streaking across the dark void and slamming into the hegemon vessel's weapons array. The explosion that followed was massive. The mercenary ship reeled from the blast, its weapon systems silenced, and for a moment, the entire battlefield was still. Cade couldn't believe it. Serena had done it. She had landed the hit they desperately needed. The enemy ship was now vulnerable. They had a chance. Cade seized the moment. With his hands steady on the controls, he fired everything they had left, missiles, plasma, and every ounce of power the ship could muster. The ship shuddered again, this time not from the enemy's blasts, but from their own retaliatory fire. The hegemon vessel exploded in a brilliant flash, pieces of debris scattering across the vast expanse of space. Cade's heart was pounding, but a wave of relief washed over him. They had done it. They had survived. But as the silence enveloped the ship, Cade couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. They had won this battle, but the war was far from over. Serena appeared in the doorway of the cockpit, her face calm but with a glint of something in her eyes, a quiet triumph. We're not out of danger yet, Cade said, his voice low, his gaze focused on the stars ahead. Serena nodded, stepping forward. I know. But we've come this far, haven't we? Cade looked at her, and for the first time, he realized just how much she had changed. She wasn't just a princess anymore. She was something more, a partner, a warrior in her own right. And together, they would face whatever came next. The silence that followed the destruction of the hegemon ship was unnerving. Cade's hand lingered on the controls, his eyes scanning the void outside, searching for any sign of further threats. The ship had suffered damage, but it was still intact, still functional. They had survived, this time. But Cade knew better than to believe it was over. The galaxy was vast, and they had made enemies far and wide. Behind him, Serena moved through the ship with quiet grace, her steps almost soundless. She was as calm as ever, but Cade could see the faint tremor in her hands as she worked to assess the damage. She had changed in the past few days, not just physically, but in the way she carried herself. No longer the princess of a fallen empire, she had become something else. Something stronger. He had known she was strong when he rescued her. But now, in the aftermath of their first real battle, Cade could see just how much she had evolved. As Serena moved to the engineering console, Cade turned his attention back to the stars. They had made it this far, but the road ahead was treacherous. The hegemon ship had been only the first of many dangers, and now, with their location compromised, they would have to tread carefully. "What's our status?" Cade asked, his voice low as Serena approached. "We're still functional," Serena replied, her voice steady. "The hull's been damaged, but we can make repairs once we're out of immediate danger. Shields are running at 60%. Weapons are offline, but I can get them back online in an hour or so." Cade nodded, though he wasn't entirely satisfied with her report. They needed more time, more distance. The longer they stayed in one place, the more likely it was that someone would come looking for them. He checked the radar again. There were no immediate threats, but that didn't mean they were safe. It would be foolish to believe they could outrun the galaxy's darkest corners forever. "Good," he said, his tone steady. "Let's keep moving. Set a course for the safe house, and keep an eye on the radar. We'll have to make it there without attracting too much attention." Serena didn't argue. She moved to the helm and punched in the coordinates, and the ship shifted as the engines roared back to life. They were on the move again, but this time, the atmosphere was different. The silence between them felt heavier. They both knew the stakes. They both knew the risks. But neither of them said anything. There was no need. As they passed through the emptiness of space, Cade's mind wandered. He thought about the choices that had led them here, about the fate that had brought him to Serena's side. He had never expected to get caught up in something this deep, this personal. But here they were, two souls linked by fate, fighting to survive in a galaxy that had no mercy. "You're quiet," Serena's voice broke through his thoughts, her eyes on the viewport. "Thinking about what comes next?" Cade didn't immediately answer. He didn't know how to put it into words, but the weight of the future pressed heavily on his chest. They were on the run, but how long could they keep this up? Eventually, the galaxy would catch up with them. The Zether Empire wouldn't let Serena go so easily. And the hegemon? They would send more ships. Cade had no doubt of that. "I'm thinking about a lot of things," he said finally, his voice quieter than usual. "About survival, about the future, and about you." Serena didn't react at first. She simply continued to watch the stars, her face unreadable. But Cade could see the subtle tightening of her jaw. She had always been a mystery to him. There was so much she hadn't said, so much she kept hidden beneath her royal demeanor. "I don't want to be your burden, Cade," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I don't want you to feel like you have to protect me." Cade turned to her, his eyes meeting hers. There was a depth in her gaze, a vulnerability that she rarely showed. It took him by surprise, but he didn't flinch. He had seen enough pain in his life to recognize it. "You're not a burden, Serena," he said, his voice unwavering. "You're a survivor. And I'm here because I choose to be. We're in this together." She didn't respond immediately, but Cade could see the subtle shift in her expression, something like relief, though she quickly masked it. It wasn't easy for her to accept help. She had been raised to be independent, to be self-sufficient. But in this galaxy, survival often required more than strength. It required trust. As the ship continued its journey, Cade felt the weight of their shared burden. The future was uncertain, and the dangers were far from over. But for the first time in a long time, Cade didn't feel so alone. Serena wasn't just a princess or a slave, she was his equal. They were both warriors in a broken galaxy, fighting for a chance at freedom. The next few days passed in relative silence, the quiet hum of the ship the only sound as they made their way deeper into Terran space. Cade and Serena worked together, taking shifts at the controls and maintaining the ship's systems. Serena had proven herself capable, more than capable, and Cade found himself leaning on her more than he ever expected. She had a sharp mind and a quick wit, and in a way, her presence made the journey more bearable. It was hard to explain, but there was something about having her at his side that gave him hope hoped that they could make it out of this alive. One evening, as they neared the coordinates for the safe house, Cade called Serena into the cockpit. The stars stretched out before them like a vast, empty canvas. But even in the emptiness of space, there was a sense of something larger, something that connected them. "We're almost there," Cade said as Serena entered the room. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for them, just beyond the horizon. "But I don't know what's waiting for us when we land." Serena studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then, with a nod, she said, "Whatever it is, we'll face it. Together." For the first time since they had met, Cade allowed himself to believe it. They had come so far, through fire and blood, and they had survived. They would keep surviving. The galaxy was vast, but it didn't matter. Not anymore. They had each other. The journey to the safe house was not an easy one. Every moment felt stretched, filled with the weight of uncertainty. Cade had been a soldier long enough to know that peace was often an illusion, a fleeting thing that disappeared the moment you believed in it. Still, as the stars outside the viewport stretched into a familiar pattern, Cade allowed himself a small moment of optimism. They had made it this far, and maybe, just maybe, they could finally find a place where they could breathe, where they could hide and regroup. As the ship neared the coordinates, Serena stood beside him in the cockpit, her eyes scanning the dark expanse ahead. The energy between them had shifted in the last few days, less tension, more understanding. Cade couldn't remember the last time he had trusted someone this completely. Serena, with her quiet strength and resilience, had become more than just an ally. She was his partner in every sense of the word. And that made what was coming next even more important. The ship's sensors pinged, confirming they were within range of the safe house. Cade's hand hovered over the controls, his gaze narrowing as he prepared to enter the atmosphere of a planet that was supposed to be a haven for fugitives like them. They needed this, needed to lay low, repair the ship, and plan their next move. But nothing in their lives had ever been that simple. "Here goes," Cade muttered, his voice low. He began the descent, the ship's engines firing in a controlled burn as they pierced through the atmosphere. Outside, the world below was an unfamiliar swirl of green and brown. It was a quiet, rural place, far from the chaos of the galaxy's warring factions. Cade could only hope that the remoteness would give them the peace they needed. The landing gear touched down with a soft thud, the ship shaking as it settled onto the ground. Serena let out a breath, her fingers lightly brushing the edge of her seat as if to steady herself. Cade felt her tension, even though she didn't speak it aloud. They both knew what landing here meant. It was their first real chance to be free, but it also came with risks. There was no such thing as safety in this galaxy, especially not when the Zether Empire would be hunting her, and mercenaries like the Hegemon wouldn't stop looking for them. "We made it," Cade said quietly, turning his gaze to Serena. She gave him a small nod, her lips curling into a subtle smile. But he could see the shadows in her eyes, the wariness that she couldn't hide. "Is it really a victory if it's just temporary?" Serena asked softly, her voice tinged with both hope and doubt. "How long before they come for us again?" Cade hesitated, his gaze lingering on the landscape outside. He had no illusions about the dangers they faced. But something about this place felt different. It wasn't just the calm that surrounded them, or the peacefulness that hung in the air. It was the sense of possibility, the feeling that they had, for a brief moment, escaped the relentless machine of the galaxy. "I don't know," he replied honestly. "But we'll fight, Serena. We'll fight until we can't anymore." Serena's eyes softened at his words. She didn't respond immediately, but there was something in the way she looked at him, a flicker of gratitude, of trust. She had never asked him to fight for her, but he knew that in this moment, she understood. They were no longer strangers thrown together by fate. They were allies, bound by shared struggle, and by the unspoken promise that they would face the future side by side. The quiet of the planet stretched out before them, but Cade knew the calm wouldn't last. The Hegemon wouldn't stop looking for them. The Zephyr Empire would continue its hunt. But for now, for this moment, they had a reprieve. It was a fleeting gift, and Cade wasn't about to waste it. "We need to secure the area and make repairs," he said, standing from the cockpit. Serena nodded and followed him down the narrow corridor. They moved through the ship together, gathering their supplies and ensuring everything was in working order. There was no time to rest, not yet, but the familiarity of routine brought a measure of comfort. As they prepared to step out into the unknown world outside, Cade noticed Serena pause at the airlock. Her expression was contemplative, distant even. He saw the conflict in her eyes, the weight of everything she had endured, and everything that was still to come. "Do you ever wonder if it's worth it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "All this fighting, all the loss." Cade considered her question for a moment. He had wondered the same thing more times than he cared to admit. In the darkness of space, in the quiet moments between battles, the weight of his choices sometimes felt unbearable. But there was one thing he knew for certain: if they stopped fighting, if they gave up now, the galaxy would crush them. It was a place of endless conflict, a galaxy where power and survival came at a steep price. But it was also a place full of people who fought for something better. "Maybe it's not about winning," Cade said, his voice steady as he looked at her. "Maybe it's about surviving long enough to make a difference. Long enough to build something." Serena looked at him then, her gaze softening. She didn't say anything, but he could see her thinking it over, considering his words. It wasn't an answer, but it was a choice, an option. And sometimes, that was enough. They stepped out of the ship, the door hissing as it opened to the strange, quiet world outside. The ground beneath their feet was solid, and the air smelled fresh, filled with the scent of grass and earth. It was the kind of place that seemed untouched by war, untouched by the horrors of the galaxy. But Cade knew that peace, like everything else, was fragile. Still, as he looked at Serena standing beside him, the weight of their journey behind them and the uncertainty of the future ahead, he allowed himself a moment of hope. They had survived. And as long as they were still breathing, there was still a chance to build something better. "This is our chance," he said, his voice quiet but full of resolve. "Let's make the most of it." Serena looked at him, and for the first time in a long while, a real smile crossed her face, a smile that spoke of hope, of defiance, and of the strength they had discovered in each other. Together, they walked forward, into a new world, ready to face whatever came next. And for the first time in a long time, the galaxy didn't feel so endless. It felt small, and they, together, were enough to conquer it. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more exciting HFY stories. Your support means the world to us. And make sure to tap the bell icon so you never miss an update. Stay tuned for our next adventure, and until then, keep exploring the stars. See you in the next video.